This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. Today is October the 20th. Got the month right, but almost got the year wrong. 2019. And this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, nature, conservancy, and everything else that's been going on in the past week.
It's fall and it's pumpkin carving season. Sydney, Australia has a pumpkin carving party each year, and the carvers do a wonderful job. It's fantastic images with votive candles behind. And, pumpkins grow quickly, and so they have a shorter season, and this year they weren't worried by the early spring rains that delayed corn harvest. Corn planting. So they grow quickly. There's competitions about how big the pumpkin can get. Some pumpkins can get to 4 foot high, and you have to move them with a front end loader. So there's a lot of moisture in there. They like to be on well-drained soils, but a pumpkin patch is an interesting one to visit, and whether it's Curtis Farms down southwest Champaign or other places that are reasonably close to you. Illinois produces 90% of the pumpkin crop, and so the soils are rich, and but they're well drained, and pumpkins like that. There are quite a lot of varieties. The Australians tend to have an edible pumpkin, which is blue. So a blue pumpkin is very common. If it comes to be in an American situation where everything is orange, there's some worried faces because the pumpkin's not turning to yellow. They're used for decoration. Sometimes they're used for cannons to see how far you can fly them, but basically they could also be eaten. Well, last week's program was unique. David helped Anya put pictures in, and the program went up on YouTube and Facebook, and within a couple of days we had a lot of hits, and basically we are somewhat concerned that the Eastlawn High School, which is a Royer designed high school and rather unique, is slated for demolition, and on Wednesday night 2 of us went to the school board meeting, and I was wanting to say that this icon is not just something that's in Paxton. It also affects the tourism of Buckley, Loda, Onaga, and south to Rantoul, Champaign, and other places. This is part of history. This is where people went to school. Anya's mother was there for the first school in school class in 1925.
Grandmother?
So, grandmother, yes. And so there's local involvement, there's regional involvement. Royer was an architect of note enough that Brian Adams has written a book on Royer, and there's a Royer historic site in Urbana. At a state and national level, there's a metaphysical interest in this school. It's so it's far beyond one school board, except that they own it and control it. There was voting behavior that was kind of put the request for many millions of dollars for a school expansion in another place, but that also had a byline that the Eastlawn school would be destroyed. That put people in a confusing situation, because if they wanted to vote for the school expansion, they also had to vote for demolition. And those two things should have been separated. In recent days, yesterday's News Gazette, it was pointed out that the school had gone to the state IEPA, Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, to change the dimension of the area that they were going to demolish. And they've reduced the area just enough to allow demolition without having to invoke IEPA details. That was kind of interesting, and it shows that there's a drive on one end to take the building out, and a drive on the other to preserve it. And it would seem that from 500 signatures and a lot of responses to radio video program, then it would seem that there's a lot of nascent Paxton involvement in possible preservation. The asbestos has been taken out of the building, which is a plus, actually, if you want to functionally reuse and bring in someone who needs to occupy an asbestos-free building. So that was in the newspaper, too. So it wasn't only us that were asking questions. I wanted to remind the school board how much this icon could help to preserve tourism in the area. They are putting in a 125-foot flagpole on 57 nearby to encourage visitors to drop in on Paxton. But other communities have had to establish a gimmick to invite people, like a 30-foot ketchup bottle or a huge shoe. And Paxton already has an icon. If it was interested in creating a right atmosphere around it. It's on Route 45. Route 45 is a highway that has been replaced by 57, so there's low traffic on it. That means we can put in kiosks and stop-offs so that we could have a trace. I would think that a trace could run from northern Wisconsin through to New Orleans because there's a lot of similar communities that have different stories. And, so I did contact the Department of Tourism to see what we might do to plan for an overall trace from north to south. If I had my druthers, I would take it back to Hudson Bay, since the climate is changing up there. That would be another interest. But for the moment, it would be safe to start at Kankakee. And Kankakee to Paxton is an old Route 45, which is still used as a road. So that section is fairly narrow, but there are places for stop-offs. There little communities and elevators that are of interest if they're interpreted in a nice way. You're looking at ecotourism, and that includes natural as well as cultural details. So I think today that I would like to give you an idea of some of the other environments that might be included in a trace that would go from, at the moment, between Kankakee and Rantoul. Even smaller than that, you could go from Paxton to Rantoul. I started Kankakee. I'm not familiar with all the details of these communities. They all have their own museums. They often have their own Carnegie libraries that are unique. They have history, and they have stories, and they have personalities. And so I'm going to start with Kankakee. It has an interesting river. It starts in the area of what's here with the Iroquois River that runs more or less northwest to combine with the Kankakee River to morph into the Illinois River, and so south. This river is an interesting river to boat on. The settlement is around it. There's a Frank Lloyd Wright building right on the waterfront. It has character of that architect's thought process, and it's a site that's well visited. There are several subsidiary communities. Bourbonnais is one. Otto is another. Otto is kind of a black community, but a farming community. And to the west is Wilmington, and quite a lot of antique dealers in that general area. I said something about last week that there are sand dunes in that area. When the glacial retreat resulted in loose or fine-grained material being blown across the state, then sand dunes were formed. So Kankakee has, in the Otto area, sand dunes that carry a different ecosystem, a dry area, Prairie. A little to the further east is the Iroquois County Conservation District, which also has sand dunes and a very dry habitat, but popular for hunting, and some of the royalty from England would come to that site to hunt. So this trace that we think of as north and south would have elements that go east and west. To the west, a little south of Kankakee, there are gravel pits, mostly limestone. But there are railroad beds in there. One comes out at Otto that brings Champaign its gravel, and brings other communities gravel too. So there are huge pits there for harvesting gravel. Just a little further to the west is Kempton, which has an interesting alternative community, which has a factory of its own, mostly graduate people who have their own industry and their own religion. And that is one of those things that's just interesting. There's an English prairie there, which is like a little triangle that was cut off by two roads, and the hypotenuse was a railroad line. And too small to turn a 10-horse team in, so it got left, and the English family owns it and cares for it, but it's a unique remnant prairie. But these communities are small communities, and they have their own festivals, and been to some of them at Kempton and Colum and places that are there. You have things like greasy pole sack fights, where each participant has a sack, and the pole is greasy so that if you are not very careful, you fall off it. But just these little differences in expressing community festivals is kind of interesting. A little further south, but to the east, is Beaverville and Donovan, and they have a small railroad line. I think it services something like 13 elevators. They have old diesel engines. They know how to take out the motors. They're a bunch of interested people who can also realize that they own Prairie on their railroad lines, and they're very respectable of that. There's L'Arable, and L'Arable is a Cajun country. It's where French people were leaving Canada, and they came to St. Anne and L'Arable, and their church and cemetery is very characteristically Cajun. And the general area, the bar that you can go to, used to be a place for the accumulation of pelts when pelts were being sold for income. The Iroquois River is nearby, and the like of Al Capone would bring contraband up the river. But Al Capone had a retreat there. Ostensibly the first floor was a brothel. He would bring his friends and relatives from the Chicago area, and there are stories that float around about Al Capone era. And many of these stories are very verbal. They're not really written down. I got one very recently, and I can't remember what it was, but it was something dramatic about the Al Capone era. So those are the little things that make this area interesting. If you go to the cemetery there, you have grave markers made out of wagon wheel steel, the outside steel of a wheel, and other little things that make you realize that people do move and do different things. Getting a little further south, you get to Gilman, and there you have quite a few railroads. You have one coming east-west and one coming at the catty corner from St. Louis and Illinois Central, all coming to the same town. And the railroads, often 60% of the people that in those towns were railroaders or elevator operators. So the town has a character that belonged to those people who were not necessarily settlers, but settlement was all around. There's a big Incombressa center there, which handles grain, and That's Portuguese in background. Brazilians have an area that is very much the same as the Midwest. So you have Midwestern people go to Brazil, and you have Brazilian people that come here, and then you have to think about world markets and who's selling what, and what is the price of corn and wheat and commodities like soybeans. So there's a whole agricultural economy there that is interesting, and if presented properly to the public, is also interesting to the public and rather intriguing. They're in the center of this. This is where the money comes from and how has it moved around. There was a guy, and often there are characters in these places, and one of them was Augie Kietzman. And I'm not sure where to start with Augie Kietzman, but he was entrenched in Gilman, but he was also very familiar with all the towns around it, whether it was Onaga, Buckley, Loader, and other communities like Thoroville, a little to the west, and even into Indiana. Augie was an innovator. He got into welding very early in the 1900s, and he had a welding shop. And when World War I was getting into planes, often biplanes, maybe all biplanes, they decided to put in an airport in Texas. And they asked, I'm not sure whether he was not purloined, to go to Texas and do some of the early work of constructing an airport. When the airport got underway, the planes were shipped to places like New York, and it was discovered that they could do a nosedive, but then they wouldn't have the power to get out of the nosedive. And a little bit of investigation found that there was a hole being drilled in the block, and it was being stuffed by rag or whatever, but it meant that the engines didn't perform properly. And Augie was accused of drilling the hole. So they put him in jail and for quite some time, and then they found out that other culprits were involved, and so Augie was released, and he became a federal agency in some respects. Between World War I and World War II, he was asked to be in the field harvesting hay, because there were a lot of German people there, and quite a few of them were Hitler supporters, and the feds wanted to know who was doing that and who was interested in what. So Augie became an agent in that respect. But Augie knew his way around. He knew the Beckwith and Butterworth explorations of the area, the early settlements, the trails they had, the early hotels that was put in on the river. He knew the geology. There was artesian water. So if you drive between Gilman and Watseka, which is almost immediately east, you would encounter a drinking trough, which is where horses and cattle would drink. There's artesian water filling into that trough. And behind it, there's a typical Augie sign. It's usually in uppercase with very little space between each word and a dot at the end of the statement with the next statement almost right on top of it, and then with a signature in the same style by Augie Kietzman. And he put this billboard up so that people would know their way around the Beckworth and Butterworth trails. And so he, before that, he knew Indian tribes that would meet there. If you want to get tribes together, you need to be in a site where tribes can cross streams, and that Iroquois, 4 major tribes could meet. And Augie got to be close to those tribes, and he eventually was given the status of Chief Morning Star. And Chief Morning Star had regalia, and he had the dances that went with it. A couple of Jim Sansi from the School of the Art Institute and others introduced us to Augie and his wife in Gilman, and they had a house with an Indian image outside, so it was easy to find. And then you got to meet Augie and his wife. He was into scouting, and he was so into scouting that he was respected at the national level and had presidential awards for being a scout leader. He owned land, and one of those pieces of land he offered to the Boy Scout industry for a retreat. But the Boy Scouts were a little slow on coming to mind with Augie, so he gave it to the Girl Scouts. And that piece of land is the Girl Scout retreat for scouting in this area. It's called Camp Wahanaha, and it's, if I remember rightly, it's near the banks of the Iroquois River. We found out that Augie was wanting to go to a ceremony in Watseka where secret society was involved. I think it was the Oddfellows, but it could have been the Modern Woodsmen or the Masons. Secret societies in these communities were very important. They were more or less insurance agencies for people. If you got kicked in the belly with a horse then and died, and you had a large family, because in those days large families were part of your workforce. Then the membership of the secret society would be essential to keeping that family afloat. Some of these agencies, like the Modern Woodsmen, are still viable. They have put all their regalia into museums. But at one stage, these were societies that had membership. You had initiation, and you didn't just happen to be involved. You had to be invited in. You had masters of ceremony. You had officials in charge of the operation. The women were on the second floor. The men were on the third floor. And that's where you would be initiated. If you were initiated, it was very serious. There would be a a coffin with a skeleton in it, and you had to realize that you had a responsibility to other generations, and there were other sorts of experiences that you had to go through. One of them that I was familiar with was where the candidate does something that means that flour is dusted into the face, which can be a rather mean experience. But just little things like that were initiations. So those societies are still there. So we took Augie and his wife to Witzany, and there a chapter was meeting. The men were all on one side, the women on another. And many of the members were people who had been veterans of World War I. So 90-year-olds could say something about the injury on their neck, which was part of that war. Some of them were very old and almost non-compass mentors. So they were retiring a chapter that had lost membership. And this chapter in Witzany also was losing membership. Augie brought his regalia and did a dance that was his interpretation of what Indian people he knew would want to see. Augie is buried at Onaga. And Onaga has a very interesting cemetery. There is a Civil War official there who was infiltrating into the Southern administration. But a dear friend of his who was probably also filtering into the Southern aspect of things, died, or before he died, the other agency visited him in the hospital, and he was caught for spying. The interesting thing is that he is buried in some place like Natchez, but he's also buried in Onaga, which brings up the thought of who was buried. And they may have exterminated a stool pigeon on behalf of the official who was escaping from being a spy. There's one person in Onaga that's buried in concrete. There's just so those communities often have ceremonies where drama people will stand on the grave of the individual and explain who they were and what they did and why they're here now. So there's that realization of history. Augie's wife was about the same age, in their 90s, I think, and she is there buried in Onaga and a place of respect. But Onaga, there is a book nursery, and it employs a lot of Mexican people, and they bring their own values and interests and concerns about migration and everything else. So every once in a while, a federal bus would arrive and and take people from south of the border out of the workforce at the Bourke Nursery. So we're coming south. There's part of Augie's family of many people, and I'm trying to think of the name of the elevator. It's like Damien is a characteristic. It used to be that there was no 57, so the expressway south was all 45. And there was always a Christmas tree on the elevator at Delray. At Buckley, I think, might have been. Oh no, there's a military school that is in the early days of education when males mostly were being educated. They were often educated in schools. Sometimes, if it was a population of that included Indians, you were taking children from the area and trying to convert them to a white form of experience. They were also fairly militaristic in style, and sometimes when the educational system changed, those buildings were empty. And for years they were filled with different groups and they continued, and I think they're continuing to have that sort of building open and useful. Sometimes you have to know that a bank or a modern facility is wanting to move into the main street of those towns. There's a temptation to take down the old buildings and put up a new. And that is very cruel. So we sometimes get calls about that and asked to present a case for preserve the dignity of the main street. I remember Thorwell being a little community west of Delray that was heavily into preparing 57. So a lot of the people from Delray, a tiny little bar there, were also driving heavy construction equipment that was putting in 57. Getting nearer and nearer to Paxton on this corridor. See how much time I have left? So you need to look for leadership. Augie Kietzman was obviously a local leader. But it's very hard to be a local leader when the paradigms of the community are fairly well set, whether you're Scandinavian or Irish or Eastern European or whatever. And so it takes a little bit of talent and a lot of guts to be able to speak your piece on a community event. You also have to know that in order to organize in those communities, you have to have people who are generous enough to be on the school board, on the city council. And it's not a job that everyone appreciates. Sometimes if you have a certain attitude, it can be fun. you can lose items and gain items and be amazed at what is happening, but it's not easy territory. So being concerned about the background for what is happening to the Eastlawn school, I called the tourism department and got an interesting response. They already are heavily involved in tourism in southern Illinois because there's a lot of people have lost their jobs as coal mines have closed. And so tourism becomes interesting. And if you go to southern Illinois, you have the tip of Illinois that was the Ohio River would come through in a different place. There's fluvial geology there that's interesting. There's also a little piece of the Ozarks, an uplift that is different. This is Shawnee Forest. The federal government has realized that the rich glaciation that came to northern Illinois didn't reach right in southern Illinois, so the soils are not as rich. So if you settle on a plot of land and it didn't produce as well as you anticipated that it would, then you allow it to go back to forest. And the federal government has been buying some of those little places to increase the Shawnee National Forest. A railroad has retired. It's called Tunnel Hill, and it has been assigned, I think, to the state, and that is visited fairly openly. The groups like the Natural History Survey and other scientific bodies do a lot of research of the natural history. And some areas of that territory are closed off if it's the time when animals are mating and they're likely to be on roads that access to the forest. So the roads are closed and the animals have their time to be. And there's enough of a area that breeding flocks and butterflies and birds and bees can get. There are also enough natural monuments that are interesting and people like to visit. And the vegetation is different and a number of different ecosystems. There's a Cache River where the rivers were changing their style depending on the amount of water that was coming through and sometimes with channelization to allow farmers to have more access to the bottomlands. So going from north to south, you already have existing some of these sorts of things that we're asking for. And it continues into Tennessee and other states going south to New Orleans. This is a pipe dream to have a trace through the state, perhaps even through Wisconsin too. When you get to northern Wisconsin, you're having more boreal forest, and there's actually a need to document some of these ecosystems because as climate is changing, partly because the planet may be in a different situation, or because there's a natural response to humans changing the environment. So this trace could not only be an educational device, but also a scientific device. Since 45 is fairly low traffic, we would need people to establish museums that are available. You don't always succeed at that. At Chanute, it was a quite interesting air museum. But if you've seen an Air 707 or whatever number plane once, you probably don't come back a lot. So that sort of museum is slightly different than if you're working with a community that has a spread of information. You have rooms for pull-offs by vehicles. You have kiosks. So one of the things that I have been talking to a lot is very wide 10 miles between Rantoul and Paxton. It has room for wildlife to mate and survive, and it is a very interesting potential prairie corridor because it has an old Route 45 in there, hidden by invasive trees like autumn olives and teasel. Some of that teasel comes down to a 9-acre plot we own north of Rantoul. And we just like to have that road resurrected as a bicycle trail. This would satisfy recreational people as well as natural history people. It goes over to moraines without wash plains like Flatville, and it's again dreaming, but sometimes dreams are important. So if you're going up 45, or even if you just want to visit, look at this area. It's owned by the Department of Transportation. It is so much more rich in prairie than our borrow pit or gravel pit. Gravel pit is regrowth succession, but we own it. But we don't own that 10 miles. So that means that we have to talk to Department of Transportation and the local garages that are involved. In the case of that 10 miles, half of it is administered by the regional office in Paris, and part of it is administered by the regional office in Ottawa. And both groups have roadside maintenance personnel, but there is also an overriding administration that is in charge of mowing. And mowing is a difficult situation. So one good example that I would like to say something about is Route 45 Savoy. There, the road was widened from 2 lanes to 3 lanes and then to 5 lanes. And this year, for the first time in about 20 or 30 years, the area behind no mow signs was mown. And so I reported this and then visited the garage that did the mowing, and I got a very good reception there. But there's also the feeling that the signs that were put up on the roadside to say no mowing were also removed by us or some other people, nobody knows who, from the ditch, so that a 15-foot bush hog couldn't mow that area. That's not so. So I'm asking for the specifications. The specifications are music size copies of what needs to happen on a road construction. It has all the cross sections of every so often along the corridor. There are enough of those planning pictures to usually make for a file that's half or 3/4 of an inch thick. These are big documents. They're the documents that are used by engineers. But in those documents are also the indications of where signs should go, and I also suspect where signs for no mowing were located. So we're in debate as to whether we can continue to no mow that area. It has a highway that's very well used, but it has 8 feet between the last lane and the Prairie. The Prairie has low spectrum prairie grasses down to the drainage ditch. Then after that, we were allowed to preserve the prairie that was there, the native prairie, the remnant prairie, and we were allowed to dipsy-doodle in where some of the native soil was removed to put on the berms so that they would green up fairly quickly. So that prairie is an excellent prairie. It has a ditch that runs down to Windsor Road, and it carries water from subdevelopments for Savoy. This is on the backside of a moraine, so the water runs from those subdevelopments into the ditch, and when it does that in an open drain, it also erodes the drain. The answer to that would be to put in a pipe which would carry the water and prevent the erosion, which would be very costly. Sometimes we're asked to accept 8 or 10 tandem truckfuls of dirt that is accumulated in the Windsor Road area at the bottom of this drain. And that will continue to happen as long as this is an open drain and the water is moving the soil. We also have a situation where Windsor Road did not have through passageway. It had a little old bridge for the railroads, and the suggestion was that the railroad be elevated some, and that a new road was put in underneath the railroad line. In order to do that, you have to move the railroad bed east a little bit, so there's a bend out and around, and you have to know that you never have the expenditure to put it back where it was. So it's a little bit of railroad line in there. And there was a very new bridge for 2 railroad lines. Later, one of those railroad lines was taken out, so there's plenty of room on the bridge. But it overlooks Windsor Road, and because it was involved in establishing the building of the ridge, there's a lot of invasion and invasive trees are at that end. And that either takes a lot of volunteer work with chainsaws, or it involves big equipment with a saw on the end. So we've had that sort of thing happen, but very quickly the reforestation occurs. So the piece of 1 mile between Windsor Road and Curtis Road is in constant conversation. If you want to mow it, even if you only want to mow 4 feet, you may not have a 4-foot mower at the Department of Transportation. So then you have to mow it with a bush hog, or you have to mow it with a 6-foot mower with 2 feet hanging over the road, which is not a popular thing for mowing people. So we, this week, have been having this debate, and you have to know that the prairie is still blooming in November, and if you mow it too soon, we don't get the seed from that particular site, and people don't get to share the New England aster, which is a late bloomer. This is not the world's greatest garden, folks. It's Prairie, and Prairie had about 100 species, and unfortunately they look like weeds, and since the settlers had to remove them in order to put in agriculture, then they're all called weeds, warts, curses, banes, and what have you. But they're our heritage. And well, I think you've got the idea of how we have to go about trying to preserve the natural and the cultural ecosystem that could be visited by tourists, but you need to have people who are specialists. So first of all, to bring people together, to find leaders, and then to create organizations that will be involved in this sort of preservation of ideas and history. And you have to have museums, and you have to have boards, and most of this is volunteer work. But when the volunteer work gets too expanded, then you do need professional CEOs or director who can spend their life doing this sort of work. And it's a very valuable occupation, and I think we're near to the end of our time. Mm-hmm. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.